All right, here he is.
I mean, for guys like you, for me, I mean, like if we're talking about sports, especially in that period, but in any period, sports is inherently political, especially for Black Americans, right? And we can't talk about Ash, Ali, Kaepernick, so many people without talking about it. And it always comes up, right? The coach who is suing the NFL, you're not letting me in. You know, the Black woman who's like, the USTA wouldn't let me play because I'm Black and I'm not the normal size. It's constantly coming up. So to act like we're going to talk about sports and never talk about politics, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's all about, as you know, the type of politics that we're talking about. And I don't even like to refer to it as politics because when you're talking about access, inclusion, equity, these are very compelling and righteous issues in sports. Like that is not politics. To me, politics is, are we debating, whether or not this particular political legislation should pass or not pass, or what are the benefits? Are we voting on this proposal, that proposal? Those are politics. What we were discussing really is the right to dignity, humanity, and access. And that was it. And that is kind of, let's be very clear about this. They're given what the hierarchy is in a lot of sports, in the sense that you have white owners, white fans, Black labor, that when the labor starts to get a little too powerful, speak a little too loud, remind you that they are not just here for your entertainment, then we run into all sorts of problems. And it is our responsibility as people in charge of chronicling what this means to speak about these issues because they're important sports topics. We're going to get to the games. You'll figure out who will win the AFC East. That's fine. But we also have to make room for this other dialogue that, as you said, is equally important. Black sports fans, maybe not 100%, but most are comfortable with these topics being intersected and discussed. And another issue is that in the minds of some people at ESPN, only a certain type of sports fan mattered. Only a certain type of sports fan should be catered to and heard. And that is what I found to be really problematic throughout our experience. They kept listening to those loud and wrong and letting them lead the conversation, as opposed to not thinking about the fact that there's just as many people who appreciate that we're talking about certain topics in this context.
Part of why you guys are so refreshing and necessary for me is I've always noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed this too, this schism that we see in a lot of sports media where it's generally short white men who probably didn't even have success in high school with sports or girls, talking about physically gifted Black men who probably were always successful in sports and with women. And there's this sort of disdain because the writers are like, we're smarter than you, but you have more money, you have more success, you're ticking off all the boxes that we wish we could tick off. So we're going to have this way of like looking down, right? You know what I'm talking about? They're sort of like looking down on the athletes. And I'm like, I hate that whole thing.
I would say in general that, and I think this has a great deal to do with why you see now so many athletes who have their own media platforms. That's why LeBron James created Uninterrupted. That's why you now have the Players Tribune and Draymond Green doing his own podcast, and JJ Redick has a podcast, and all these players who want to find their voices and who want to be a voice. And the media's failings is a huge engineering force behind that. The majority of my career in sports media has been overwhelmingly white and male. Like 80 to 90% of the jobs in sports media are held by white men. And with that comes seeing athletes through a certain lens. And often that lens is not respective of culture. It is not respective of history and does not understand optics, racial dynamics, gender dynamics, those sorts of things. And when the athletes get tired or they've gotten tired of being dehumanized, so you have Naomi Osaka deciding she don't want to do press conferences, okay? And being fed up, and Simone Biles telling you, I don't owe you anything, all right?
We see guys, Westbrook, other guys get frustrated. Like, I'm sick of you guys with these stupid questions. And like, I feel for them.
It's it's some of it is the lack of dignity in which they feel like they haven't been covered properly. And listen, don't get me wrong. I want to make room for the fact that there are plenty of athletes who are covered quite accurately, just don't like what's being said. Okay. All right. There's that too, for sure. But I do think the lack of diversity in sports media makes it that much more difficult for the athletes to trust that these opinions are and framing and narratives are coming from people who do not understand them. Like they just don't trust that they actually understand them because they look out and they don't see anybody that actually looks like them. So, I think that's a problem with how sports are framed and how and why certain very obvious racial disparities have gone completely unchecked. And no one's asking more questions about these things, and why owners have been allowed to sort of sit in their Wizard of Oz tower, and the people taking all of the criticism and the hits are the players, and they become the enemy to the people in many cases, even when it's the people and the players that have way more in common than people do with owners.
Um, I love the prevalence of athletes on television and in podcasting talking about their sports. And I think for the most part, it's great. And Draymond is a fantastic addition to that whole group. It bothers me when he says this is new media, because I'm like, okay, brother, you're doing a great job, but you're not doing anything new. You're not breaking ground. And we've been seeing athletes, I think it's more, but we've been seeing athletes on television talking about their sport for decades. I don't think that he's doing media in a different way because he is an insider. I think he's doing it well. But like when he says this is new, then I start to like my shoulders start. I'm like, no, it's good, but it's not new. So stop calling it new. Do something different. Like, what do you think about that?
I love the fact that Draymond has embraced having a platform, and he's like the perfect person to do it. I also my issue is not necessarily with it being called new media. I understand why he says that to some degree, because and the only reason I think, and not that this is particularly new, but I think for this age of media that we're in, it wasn't really a blueprint for it. But I think athletes owning their own stories, and for that matter, coming after the media that comes after them, I would see it in like the locker room or something like that. You would see it on a smaller scale, but nobody, you're not used to athletes having a consistent platform where every week he's like, let me go in on this person that said this about me and like explain why they're wrong or explain why this narrative is wrong. They just usually didn't have the consistent mouthpiece. So that part of it is a little new. But here's where I would compare what Draymond is doing and other athletes to what Noriega is doing on Trick Champs. I think these are both great platforms where you have people who have been the subject matter now are in a position to be the interviewers, but that doesn't make you a journalist. Doesn't make you a journalist. And that's where, and I do feel, and Draymond hasn't said this, so I'm not going to attach this to him, but I do feel like there's too many athletes, much like, again, Noriega called himself a journalist. Love Noriega. Have met him like, sweet dude, you're not a journalist. And I'm not saying that because I have a journalism degree and you don't. It's just not a degree thing. That understand, as you know, as a journalist, is that part of our jobs and responsibilities is to hold people in power accountable, is to hold, is to ask tough questions, is to dig at the truth. All of these things are part of the function and core of journalism. And sometimes, a lot of times, those guys don't really do that. Noriega said his platform was to give artists their flowers. It is not our jobs to give you your flowers. It is our job to put what you're doing in context to explain it, to corroborate it. Not our job to be your publicist. And I think that's the part that is very different between the function of what some athletes and entertainers do in a media space versus what we do in a media space.